Who owns the moon? Nobody. But like many things in the law, complex arguments lie in wait for the unwary. Hi, I'm Dave Dooling, Education Director at the New Mexico Museum of Space History. Welcome to another story from space. When we talk about law in space, you probably think about these guys, or these. A lot of our perception of space law stems from Hollywood's depictions of the Wild West. And no, the new U.S. Space Force will not be the space cops. Surprisingly, there is law in space, a lot of it. It's largely in the form of international treaties and grows from work by Hugo Grotius, who never envisioned deciding who owns the moon. Grotius was born in 1583. By age 24, he was Attorney General of Holland, Zeeland, and West Friesland. This set the stage for space by way of the sea. The 1600s were a dynamic, dangerous era for mariners as European nations elbowed each other out of the way for business in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Holland was one of the maritime powerhouses. In 1609, Grotius wrote Mare Liberum, or The Freedom of the Seas. He argued that the sea is common to all because it is so limitless that it cannot become a possession of anyone, and because it is adapted for the use of all. Grotius was not the first to advance this idea, and it was not universally accepted. In England, John Selden argued for a mare clausum, or closed seas, that nations could own. The eventual compromise, suggested in 1702 by Cornelius van Binkershoek, another Dutch lawyer, was the 3-mile territorial limit, set by the range of shore-based cannon, but now extended to 12 miles by most nations. Okay, we skipped over a lot of important subtleties, but that is the basic law of the sea, as largely settled a century ago. How does that get us to the moon? Science fiction writer Robert Heinlein tackled the issue in 1950. In The Man Who Sold the Moon, a robber baron wheels and deals with nations crossed by the moon's ground track. He followed the legal principle that whoever owns a piece of land owns everything to hell below and heaven above. It was brought into English law by Edward I around 1300 and controls things such as a neighbor's roof over your yard. In the late 1700s, the heaven above concept was used to sue early balloonists, but eventually fell out of favor. In the United States, a chicken farmer unsuccessfully sued the Army for flying too low over his property. In 1946, the U.S. Supreme Court drew the line at 365 feet or 111 meters. But where does airspace become outer space? Russia accidentally settled part of the issue in 1957. At the height of the Cold War, the United States was working on its first spy satellites. Officials worried, how would Russia react when the spy in the sky passed over them? Claim their sovereign airspace was violated? But on October 4, 1957, when Russia launched Sputnik 1 first and it passed over the United States, the Russians said, "If you don't like it, too bad." And we silently said, "Thank you. You just established legal precedent. Satellites in space are like ships on the high seas." But it didn't settle the issue of how low you can go, and we still have no legal definition of where space begins, only a line for keeping records. And with the space race underway, eyes naturally turn to the moon, and people ask, will the first nation there own it? In 1959, Russia's Luna 2 became the first man-made object to hit the moon. It carried the Soviet state emblem, but no claim of ownership was made. In 1961, the United States started Apollo, its man on the moon program, and the question became more urgent. In 1965, the United Nations started working on what became the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. Known better as the Outer Space Treaty, it came into force in 1967, 2 years before the first man on the moon. In some ways, it is the ultimate expression of Hugo Grotius's work. It declared that space was open for all to explore without restraint by other nations. The treaty bars signatories from laying claim to any celestial body, meaning no one owns the moon or an asteroid or planet, or even empty space. So, when Neil Armstrong became the first human on the moon in July 20, 1969, and planted the U.S. flag, he did not claim it in the name of the United States. Instead, we came in peace for all mankind. It holds that nations retain sovereignty over anything they launch. A nation's laws thus travel with the spaceship like a ship at sea. That means that on International Space Station, you can easily float from Russia through the United States and then into Japan or the European Union. And contrary to popular opinion, it did not ban all weapons in space. Certainly not guns and astronaut survival kits, just nuclear and weapons of mass destruction. More space treaties followed. The 1967 Rescue Agreement requires rescue and return of astronauts who may land in the wrong country. The 1972 Space Liability Convention holds nations responsible for damage by their launch vehicles or spacecraft. The biggest example came in 1977 when the USSR's Cosmos 954 satellite scattered nuclear debris across Canada. The 1976 Registration Convention requires that nations supply the United Nations with details about their spacecraft. Then things bogged down. The proposed 1979 Moon Treaty stated that resources in place would be the, quote, common heritage of mankind. What that meant, and rules for private ownership, were left undefined. Spacefaring nations walked away, and the treaty lies in limbo, without legal power beyond the few nations that signed it. And since the Outer Space Treaty only binds nations, can you own the moon? Chilean lawyer Leonardo Gallardo Vera registered his ownership of the moon in 1953. Gregory Nemitz claimed asteroid Eros and sent NASA a parking bill for landing a spacecraft there. A federal court dismissed his case. There have been enough claims to make a book, Unreal Estate: The Men Who Sold the Moon, by Virgiliu Pop. He is a Romanian space attorney who claims to own the sun, but only to make the point that such claims are silly and unenforceable. These are not esoteric questions. Mining the asteroids was the stuff of science fiction in the 20th century, but now attracts investors. The moon and asteroids are rich in metals like iridium, palladium, and rhodium. These are essential to modern electronics, but difficult to mine safely on Earth. And what do you do when tourists arrive? While they are governed by the laws of their nations of origin, can we keep them from wrecking the historic Apollo landing sites? Under a NASA grant, Dr. Beth O'Leary of New Mexico State University outlined how to protect the Apollo 11 and 17 sites, the first and last in the Apollo program. Her work is taking hold. In April 2020, the White House issued an executive order known as the Artemis Accords, named for the Project Artemis program to return humans to the moon. It calls for the United States and other nations to start work on legal mechanisms for encouraging international support for the recovery and use of space resources. Although still in work, it largely reaffirms existing treaties that the United States has signed. Goals for the U.S. and partner nations include transparency about plans and policies, common design standards like the docking ports on space station, releasing scientific data as soon as possible, establishing safety zones to avoid interference, and protecting historic sites and artifacts, as Dr. O'Leary proposed. In a way, it's a plan to make a plan, as we try to keep the legal challenges smaller than the space challenges. Thanks for joining us, and stay tuned for more stories from space.